So just a little while ago, the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, made a very interesting comment about local New York Republicans. Here it is.
And we're here to say that the era of Trump and Zeldin and Molinaro, just jump on a bus and head down to Florida where you belong, okay? Get out of town. Get out of town. Because you don't represent our values. You are not New Yorkers.
That seemed like a pretty good offer, so I wanted to talk to somebody who had actually taken that advice, and I couldn't think of anyone better than my pal Karol Markowicz, who is a terrific columnist at the New York Post. She also writes, I'm reading this, but I didn't know this, she also writes for Fox News, Real Clear Florida, Spectator Magazine, and many other outlets. Karol, it is great to see you. How are you?
So good to see you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have to. This is the only way I can talk to you because now you live in Florida, where there are alligators, and I'm.
Again, you have a standing offer and a guest room.
Now, actually, the reason I wanted to talk to you, aside from the fact that you're a great political observer, is because you are a true New Yorker. Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely. I grew up in Brooklyn. My husband grew up in Queens. We were going to raise our kids in Brooklyn. We had a life plan, and then the pandemic hit and we saw things that we could not unsee. Okay.
All right. So, well, first, let me ask you, what's your reaction when you hear Kathy Hochul say that? What is your first reaction to that?
Well, from my perspective, it's like, welcome. I would love to have more conservatives move to Florida, turn this into an even redder state. And I root for New York to do better and to succeed because I still have family there. I still love that stupid place. You know, it was my home for so long. And I really did have a very warm feeling about it throughout my whole life. I mean, I always knew it was kind of kooky and leftist, but until the pandemic, that kind of stuff really didn't bother me on a day-to-day basis. And so for Kathy Hochul to chase away sort of the saner voter in New York, the people who are going to bring that state back, if it ever does come back, it's really their loss. It's their loss and Florida's gain.
Explain to people, and you really do have to explain this to people, what you like about New York. I lived in New York for 10 years. I dreamed about getting out every day. But I have three brothers there, one of whom, or two of whom, I think if you took them out of New York, they would simply suffocate and die like fish pulled out of the river.
Hey, I thought I would.
Yeah.
I thought for sure that we could never live anywhere else. And look, for a long time, that would have been a hilarious proposition that we would be leaving to New York. That just would never happen. But what happened is the pandemic forced a lot of things to the forefront that had been sort of hidden. I think one of the main things is that there is a lot of inequality in New York, and it all comes from the left. The left forces this inequality. So they closed schools, for example. And then I lived in Park Slope, a very, wealthy, well-to-do, very, very left area. And they all got their kids private tutors or pods, or they sent them to private school, or they went to live at their beach house and sent them to public school there. And none of them spoke up for the kids that they knew must have been suffering with these school closures. And so stuff like that, I could no longer just not care that everybody was a crazy leftist around me. It was having a direct impact, not just on my family, because look, I can get my kid a tutor, I can get them a pod, but it wasn't about that. It was about their silence, for all the people that couldn't. And I couldn't live with that anymore. And so, what I loved about New York is it was a crazy, free, amazing place to grow up. Even when the crime was high, even when things were bad, we were all kind of in it together. And the pandemic really showed that was not the New York anymore. We were absolutely not in it together. People were calling police on their neighbors for having too many people over at their house. I saw insanity. I mean, I saw really people screaming at children for not being masked, outdoors, obviously, and so much craziness that you just couldn't come back from it.
One of your best lines, I thought, during that period, I lived in New York. I was there during the worst period New York had ever seen, the 70s and the 80s, the late 70s and the 80s. And I was there during the blackout and the riots and all this stuff. And New York always had this reputation of being crazy but tough. When things went bad, everybody got together and they toughed it out and all this. And we had a sense of humor. But you pointed out that really New York was weak during this. New Yorkers were weak. They were weak and snivelly. And now my question is this. Every time I bring this up to New Yorkers, and I know a lot of New Yorkers, they say, well, you weren't there for the first part of this thing. It was such a trauma. It was so bad. Bodies in the street, people dying, grandparents being carted off, we got it worse than anybody else, and maybe we overreacted. Is there any fairness to that?
Well, so for a long time, I thought that that was the truth. I thought that, okay, yes, we did get hit harder than anybody else. It was very traumatic. We did not leave New York in 2020. We were there the whole time. And I thought, okay, but my city comes back from this kind of thing. 9/11, I was there for that. Blackout of 2003, I was there for that. So we do bounce back from things, but this was something else entirely. I still don't see New York bouncing back. And again, it wasn't so much the trauma. So like, 9/11 happened, or any of these other incidents happened in New York. And that really was about the trauma. We all went through it together. This was about what the trauma exposed. And it was like, it wasn't just that something bad happened to us. It showed that we were like bad people to each other and that we didn't care about each other in a way that we had previously cared about each other. It was like 9/11 happened and nobody ran into the buildings and nobody tried to save anybody. And everybody just kind of went their own way and was like, well, maybe you shouldn't have been in that building that day. It was really that kind of thing. It was like, maybe this is your fault that your kids aren't in school. Maybe you should, care about other people. Maybe you shouldn't want grandma to die or the teachers to die. Or maybe you should think about, homeschooling them or whatever it was. It was like, it was your fault for wanting the normalcy that everybody else seemed to have around the country.
That's really interesting. Now, when I was there for Christmas time, I was there for a bunch of parties. And I think all of them but one, of course, it was the Reason Party. It was the Libertarians.
I saw you there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But all of them were canceled because Omicron started. And I would say to people, I'm going to Nashville and they're not masking up for this. And their numbers are the same as yours. And kind of a veil would fall over people's eyes. They were just like, they couldn't take it in. So, all right. So how'd you wind up in Florida? Besides Kathy Hochul
Florida
telling
became, well, it was, she didn't tell me soon enough. I wish she had let me know earlier. Florida became this beacon of freedom. We kept hearing that this governor that was sort of not that well known at the time, Ron DeSantis, was moving to open schools. And all the headlines were, Governor DeSantis tries to open schools as COVID cases rise. And this was not summer of 2020. This is summer of 2021. This is like, Florida schools open earlier than everybody else. My kids have been in school for weeks at this point. And so they had this thing happen. So 4 teachers died in Florida, summer 2021. School had not started yet. So the fact that 4 people died and they happened to be teachers it was completely irrelevant. It was like 4 plumbers died. We can no longer have plumbing. And so you saw him kind of defy this rhetoric. I think a lot of weaker politicians would have folded. That's a moment that I keep coming back to, where these 4 teachers in Miami-Dade died over summer break. And everybody kind of looked at him and said, well, Governor DeSantis is not going to open schools now that these teachers died. And he was like, no, we need to put kids first. Kids need to go back to school. And he just proceeded on and did the right thing. And so a lot of these moments, my husband and I were watching from afar and we were like, that is what we want. We want that sanity for our kids. And we did sort of a test run in 2021. We lived in a different part of Florida than we do now, sent our kids to full-time in-person school while school was like sometimes school in New York City. And we really loved it. And it is from the governor. He definitely sets the tone. But Floridians just bring an aura of normalcy to raising children that I hadn't seen in New York in a very, very long time. It didn't matter if you were on the left or the right. You weren't wearing a mask outside. You weren't forcing kids to mask in school. And you were surely arguing that all schools should be open.
That's you have, as I recall, like 47 children. Is that correct?
Yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah, somewhere. I can't remember. Somewhere in that vicinity.
I have 3.
You have 3. Okay.
But it does feel like 47.
And so they're fairly widely spaced, and so you're dealing with all levels. Is there experience in school? I mean, would you say are these public schools or private schools?
They're public, public schools, and my 3 kids are very different. They're 3 super different from each other children. And we found that Florida schools really met their needs. It was like they were meeting them where they are. If the kid, one of my kids is like pretty advanced. One of my kids is like kind of behind, mostly due to the pandemic. And one of my kids is like pretty on track. And the schools really adjusted to them. I had no idea because in New York, we talk a lot of smack about other states' schools, but Florida schools have been phenomenal. I've been very impressed.
Well, one of the things that got me about that Kathy Hochul thing is they go to Florida where you belong. That phrase
Right.
is, kind of like, it was kind of like,
Right.
it reminded me of like on the waterfront, you come from Greenport, go back to Greenport. Now, as a New Yorker, you come to Florida, obviously there's no culture, no one can read. I'm sure everybody's illiterate, right? Now, what is it like culturally? How is it culture shock for you?
So, I mean, I would say that the biggest culture shock is that like you can't call for Chinese food and have it like at your door before you hang up the phone. And that's we joke, but that's actually been a really tough adjustment for our family. It's like 6:30 on a Tuesday, and we're like, wait a minute, what are we eating? And now we have to wait an hour. But no, I think Florida is in such a great moment right now. It's really flourishing. There's so many people, the constant flow of people coming through and staying and moving. I have people reaching out to me all the time and saying to me, like, where should I move in Florida? And I'm like, I really don't know. I only know like 3 places. So I recommend the same 3. Sorry to those 3 towns because that's all I got. But it's having a moment, and I hope that moment lasts a while. But even if it doesn't, our family is very happy and settled and normal here, and it's fantastic.
Do you think you'll ever go back? I mean, is there anything that New York could do that would make you go back?
So it's funny because my husband and I, our plan was always to raise our kids in Brooklyn and retire to Manhattan. So like, I don't say never. Maybe, when I'm retired and we move back to Manhattan or something, I can't say never. And I don't want somebody to find me in 50 years and be like, you said never. But not for my children's, like, until I will commit to not until they go to college, if ever. And wow. I find that, Florida also turns out 1 or 2 people have retired here in their lives. So maybe we'll stay.
So you're finding it livable. I mean, you find
I'm loving it.
And I'm not making fun because I just know you're a dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker, and it's a big
I really was. I miss my family, and that's about it. I maybe like spicy Asian food, really those 2 things, and that's it. But everything else is, I wake up happy every day, and I really can't convey. And then I know other parents of like small children really get this, but like I worry so much less about my kids here. And for a long time it was COVID pandemic related things, but now it's things like I don't worry about my first grader learning gender theory in school. Just not something that I need to like watch out for. Nobody's asking him his pronouns in first grade, and other things like that. I have a weight lifted off of me where I don't have to be this extremely monitoring parent who has to like look at every single thing that the school presents because I'm looking for that sneaky leftism that is in there and is coming. It's a giant weight lifted off me. I sleep a lot better. So
talk about the governor. Is he popular there? I mean, I can see they're just like gearing up to rip him to pieces every single day. How do the people feel about him?
I have yet to meet anybody who doesn't like him. I meet people on the left also. And again, I think that what happened during the pandemic has so shaped people. I mean, you have like restaurant owners who are maybe liberal, but are so grateful to him for keeping their businesses open. They know how it went in other places. And I know so many parents that feel that same level of gratefulness that closing schools was just not an option in 2021. And that was the way it was. And that's the way it was going to be. They see him as brave. And I fully see that also. He has stood up in so many different ways to so many different people and said, this is the way it's got to be. And again, it wasn't easy. I come back to that, the 4 teacher deaths. I think a lot of other politicians would have folded. I think they would have said like, okay, maybe we'll start at a hybrid. Maybe we'll start with masks and see how it goes. And he was just like, no, this is how it's going to be. And he turned out to be right. And I think a lot of people owe him an apology that's not coming, but he knows how grateful my family is. I tell him all the time. And I feel like a lot of families like mine. I also run into people who are like, I know you, I know who you are. I've seen your story. We also moved here and we followed, basically the same path as you, where we were thinking about it. And then one day we just up and left.
Karol, it's always interesting talking to you, so I was expecting this to be interesting, but it's actually quite a remarkable conversation to hear somebody talk about the weight lifted off of your shoulders of moving to a blue state. I always wonder why people, for instance, in San Francisco, tolerate the increasing dysfunction of a Democrat government, why people in New York tolerate it. And now that I listen to you, I wonder even more. They probably just don't know how good it is when it stops. It's great to see you, and it's great to hear. It's great to hear it's going so well. And believe me, if it weren't for the allegations alligators, I'd be right there with you.
Come on down. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Karol. If you are desperate for more Klavan-y goodness, and you know you are, like and subscribe to the Andrew Klavan Podcast.